Thank you all so much for making the time to be with us. I'm just wondering if we need to give it a few more minutes for people to join, because there's still the same number of people that there were when we were doing the technical setup. But in any case, I will start off by introducing myself, and then we can slowly get started. So my name is Josephine Whitaker Yılmaz, and I work for Oxfam KEDV, which is a national civil society organisation working with marginalised women, including refugee women, across Turkey for the last 30 years. We're a member of the Oxfam Confederation, as well as an executive board member of the Refugee Council of Turkey. And I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to moderate today's discussion, which is happening, as you all should know, in the context of the Marmara Urban Forum 2021. For the next 90 minutes, we're going to be talking about the self-representation and meaningful participation of refugees and other people with lived experience of forced displacement in decision-making processes. And critically, what needs to be done to put refugee leadership at the centre of policymaking that relates to refugees. This is a critical subject of discussion, of any discussion when it comes to responding to forced displacement, but one that's unfortunately been neglected for a really long time. We know that refugees and others who've experienced forced displacement have always in practice taken the lead in looking after themselves and their families and responding to their own needs. And we also know that including refugees in substantive ways is not only the right thing to do morally and ethically, it also results in policies and programs that are more effective. In recent years, particularly since the New York Declaration of 2016 and the Agreement of the Global Compact in 2018, there's been a growing recognition of the importance of refugees' participation and leadership in decision-making processes that affect their lives. And more than ever, we've been seeing small openings and opportunities for refugee leadership and participation within the international refugee response system. But progress remains uneven, and there's still a really long way to go to ensure progress across the board. Keeping this conversation alive and continuing to push for more inclusive practices from all players at all levels, recognizing also, the vital importance of cities in this context. This is paramount to creating relevant policies and practices that reflect people's experiences and needs. Our panelists today come from all around the world, from many different backgrounds, but they're united in championing the meaningful participation and self-representation of refugees. Now, I'm briefly going to introduce our panelists before we get into the discussion. So with us today, we have Mohamed Badran, who is an anthropologist, advocate, and community mobilizer from Damascus, Syria, who has founded a number of different refugee-led networks, including the Global Refugee-Led Network and the Syrian Volunteers in the Netherlands, where he currently works. Together with two other refugee leaders, he also launched the G100 initiative, a mobile dialogue platform that brings together refugees and migrants with experts and decision makers to find solutions to key challenges in cities across Europe. We also have with us Dr. Zakira Hekmat, the founder and president of the Afghan Refugee Solidarity Association. Originally from Afghanistan, she is based in Kayseri, Turkey. As well as working as a medical doctor, she's been advocating for migrants and refugees for decades, with a particular focus on supporting local communities and refugees to live together harmoniously. Zakira is also the recipient of multiple awards, recognizing her contributions in the field of refugee advocacy, including Peace Builder of the Year from the Washington-based charitable organization Hasna, and the Angela Burden-Kutz Award from Ankara-based Research Center on Asylum and Migration. She also sits on the executive board of the Refugee Council of Turkey. Sana Mustafa is a director of partnerships and engagement at Asylum Access, where she leads fundraising and partnership initiatives, bringing together refugee-led organizations and refugee response institutions. Originally from Syria, she has founded two refugee-led networks, the Global Refugee-Led Network and the Network for Refugee Voices. She's also run her own consultancy focused on refugee inclusion, partnering with institutions such as TENT, WeWork and Oxfam. She's a champion for shifting the narrative around refugees and elevating the powerful role that they play in society and in their communities. And we also have with us Paul Power, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the Refugee Council of Australia. And he's been in that role since 2006. And as the head of this national umbrella body on refugee policy, he helps to lead NGO advocacy with the Australian government and the United Nations agencies in Australia. Under his leadership, the RCOA has been strongly committed to creating opportunities for people who have been refugees to take up leadership roles in national and international policymaking processes. The RCOA has also helped to support the first Asia-Pacific Summit of Refugees and the first ever Global Summit of Refugees, both in 2018, and is working closely with a number of local and national international refugee-led networks around the world. So I'd like to give a big thanks to all of our panelists and a welcome to all of them from all around the world. Now, before we start our discussion, I'd like to invite everyone listening to think of any burning questions you might have about refugee self-representation and participation. And I'd encourage you to write these in the chat as we go along so that we can try to incorporate some of these in the questions that we put to the panelists. I'm also going to try and ensure that we have at least 30 minutes at the end to have an open discussion and to answer some of your questions directly. Without further ado, I think we should turn to the questions now. For our panelists, we've got 4 main questions to ask, and you'll each have around 3 minutes to answer them. And I'll give you prompts on time just to try and make sure that we have enough time for questions at the end. So I'd like to start off by asking, by way of an introduction, what does self-representation and meaningful participation mean to you? And why is it important? And if you could give us a few examples of how you're working on these issues, that would be great. So I'd like to put this first question to Sana, if you don't mind. I know it's very early for you.
Yes, no worries. Thank you so much, Josephine, and for the organizers for inviting us and creating the space for this conversation. I guess I came through this question initially after having been forcibly displaced from Syria by the Assad regime. It wasn't really like a philosophical question for me. It was just a very a personal experience in many ways. And apparently it's called self-representation. When I came to the US and I started engaging on my own affairs, I found out that I was not expected to be engaged on my own affairs as a refugee. And this is exactly when the moment that I decided to change this and to challenge all the different institutions and systems in place that really just by default exclude people of forced displacement from addressing their own affairs and their own issues. And this is really started the journey back in 2015, I would say, 2014. And I started advocating for the right for self-representation. And I think the piece of meaningful inclusion it came right after demanding the seat on the table, realizing that, many people realizing that we don't want to make this about tokenistic representation, and it's very easy to make it about one. So how can we then address that once you have the seat on the table? How do we ensure that the seat is actually equal? How, when we bring people into partnerships, into programs, and into co-designing, how actually it is co-designing, it's co-ownership, and it's co-agency over any initiative. And this is the kind of the meaningful piece of it, is to move beyond tokenism and to really think meaningfully about what are we doing to facilitate people access to spaces, people access to resources, people access to money, to be able to be equal partners, and as a result to meaningfully engage. I would say in the past, in terms of the things that we've been working on for the past 7 years, it would be really it started the journey with mindset shifting. It really has, it's still a journey, but it's taken a lot of advocacy on all levels, national, regional, and global, to even start the conversation about self-representation and meaningful inclusion of refugees in their own affairs. I remember very well being in Geneva early in 2015 and 16, and talking with personals from UNHCR about refugee self-representation. And it was like hearing comments like, good luck. If this is your agenda, good luck. The system has been operating this way for over 70 years. The system, is an extension of colonialism. So good luck decolonizing the system, basically. And I think we've started in many ways, yes, we started this decolonized agenda, and a lot of allies joined and realized, non-refugees who are part of this system realized that it's this time of the of history when you decide on which side you want to be. And in the time of movements, like the women rights movement, the Black Lives Matter, and other movements, it's really about exercising true allyship when you are none of those people. And this is not different at all from the forced displacement movement. And with that being said, a lot of the work had been and continues to be about advocacy and mindset shifting into actually moving from tokenistic representation to meaningful one, which calls upon institutions, all of the institutions, from local level civil society institution to government, to think about internally about the changes that are needed for them to go through their own journeys that would organically then reflect on their programs and policies. And those internal changes include representation, obviously, and creating environments in their institutions to bring on people with forced displacement experience to actually, from within those institutions, change the ways of working. And externally, that also means, for me, bringing the ability to create spaces for people of forced displacement to come together and to discuss the different realities and the different experiences, but also the similar ones. And that was through the creation of the different networks, such as the Global Refugee-Led Network and Network for Refugee Voices. And I would say just one last thing is that currently, in thinking and sharing about how it's been manifesting, with my work with Asylum Access and the launch of the Resourcing Refugee Leadership Initiative that has won the Larsen Lam Iconic Impact Award, $12 million, we're bringing that to life. We're moving from advocacy only and mindset shifting. We're adding to that the implementation of how do we actually enable meaningful participation, and that's by shifting power and resources. In our specific case is really money back to the hands of refugee-led organizations and moving philanthropic power from global north to global south to global south.
Great. Thank you very much, Sana. That was brilliant. Zakira Hanum, can I put the same question to you next, please? What does self-representation and meaningful participation mean to you? And how are you working on these issues?
Çok teşekkürler bu programı düzenleyen ve Josephine Hanım.
Thank you very much indeed for organizing such a nice incident. Actually, of course, as you know, that in different countries and there are different displacement and migrations, as you know, in all over the part due to the different reasons, and actually, and so by the different countries, and of course, and by in different countries, and the migration and refugees have been always on the spot, and of course, however, it was not from the first mouth of the refugees and the migrants, of course, and this refugee asylum seeking refugees and migrant, and of course, this understanding changes from country to country. And I've been living and working in the Turkey since 2008 on the refugee asylum seeking and the migration. And actually, as you know, that when I moved to Turkey, the number of the refugees were not a lot actually in 2008 actually, and actually starting from the 2009 actually, I have seen that there is a gap, and there was no civil society organization that represents the refugees and the migrants, and actually we have started to coordinate as an foundation and as an association, as you know that it is the person, if you are sick and if you are ill, so it is yourself actually, you can express yourself better rather than your parents or your spouse or your children. Actually, it will be the case for the refugees. Actually, the problems would be different if it is heard from the first mouth by the refugee himself or herself, or the other third person, or especially for the decision making and planning, and of course the second mouth or third mouth actually could narrate these problems very differently, and therefore it will not be a direct, it will be an indirect speech actually, and therefore in order to create a direct speech for the refugees, and we have to start to work, and therefore self-representation of the refugees in the decision making and in the planning and the programming phase is really so important. And then actually after the 2011 when the internal war started in Syria, and a very high flow of migrants started to came from the Syrian side, and the total number is more than 40 million at the moment. And therefore actually we have established the MARSA, and actually it was the first association in Turkey, this Afghan refugees as a solidarity association. And actually starting from the 2017, both NGOs and also joint organizations and so started to appear. And actually in starting from the 2017 and 2018 actually as the association, we started to select the people who are the capable of representing themselves, and like the Iraqi refugees needed to select their own representative leaders. And also there were migrants coming from the Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran and Syria, and these refugee people and needs to select their own representative leaders. And we started to participate to the decision making processes on the local level, and on also afterwards after the national level, in order to let the local government, for example, to know more about the needs and also requirements of the refugees from the first mouth instead of the second or the third mouth, and also in order to contribute any strategy or plan and program that will be compiled or generated for the people. And therefore, and actually, as you know, that we have seen that rather than a third party or host country representatives, and we have seen that the refugees trust a Syrian, for example, for the Syrian people, or an Afghan leader for an Afghan refugees, and as they have the common problems, common issues that they are sharing, and the common objectives that they are sharing, and therefore we have seen that they are more they trust more their own local representatives, and instead of the third party representatives. And actually we have seen that it is something that needs to be available in all over the world, not only in particular place of the world. Çok teşekkür
for sharing that. Can we move now to Mohammed? Would you mind sharing your reflections on the same question?
Yes. Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you also for inviting me also to be here on this panel. This question actually is very much also connected to my own personal experience. I mean, as someone who was born as a Palestinian refugee in Syria, and growing up around the different system and different policies that has been set before us, and then we have to act upon it. And then again, when I had to make the journey to the Netherlands, and then I've seen that how inhumane the way, or this system, and dysfunctional actually system, that and how it treats refugees, either as victims or as a threat or as a burden, and that's actually where the main problem is. So self-representation or refugee meaningful participation, it actually breaks that vicious cycle, the cycle of keeping repeating and treating refugees in this way. And we're trying to, I mean, if you look at this system, it's actually not helping the refugees. Refugees are stuck at the borders. Refugees are being faced with obstacles because of the policies. And these policies were supposed actually to help refugees instead of making it more difficult for them. And that is the main issue when it comes to policies and solutions that are being designed without the participation, meaningful participation of refugees themselves. So here, for example, in the Netherlands, I mean, there's many examples of refugee, for example, doctors who came to the Netherlands, and they cannot even work as doctors because all of these systems and policies that have been set to not recognize their talent, not recognize their diplomas. So most of them there are right now just sitting without being able to contribute meaningfully to the society, and that's put them, at the margin of the society. And then it becomes here the question: how do you break that vicious cycle that you come to a new society, you come to a predominant discourse about what is to be a refugee. And that can only happen through refugee self-representation and refugee meaningful participation. Breaking that cycle, breaking that narrative, breaking that space that has been dominated by non-refugee policymakers or advocates, or it's about being close to the reality on the ground, and no one can actually bring that reality unless they are the same people who have experienced these policies, who has experienced personally and actually these obstacles and these challenges. And here comes then the question that how can we make these policies more effective? And the only and here it comes, the refugee participation or refugee self-representation. It is not something that you do an extra or something you do ad hoc. It is necessary to making these solutions meaningful and sustainable for the refugees, to make sure that we are helping refugees and not putting more obstacles and more challenges in their way, so that they are being marginalized at the end of the day. So that's, drawing from these examples, drawing from our experiences from the Netherlands and from Europe, that's mainly how was our objective, to make sure that refugees have access to these spaces and making sure that we are breaking that narrative and breaking that cycle of independency on these different actors.
Great stuff. Thank you very much, Mohammed. And I can see there's clearly some common themes emerging from what each of you has said, with a focus on breaking the cycle, changing the narrative, and making the shift from a situation in which there's no participation by those who've experienced forced displacement and the space is dominated by people without such experience, to tokenistic participation in some cases, and then the shift on to meaningful participation, and then, as Sana was saying, to an actual shift in the power within the system. I think that's really important to note. Paul, before we go on to the next question, would you like to reflect on those two questions? Just maybe it would be good to hear a bit more about what you've been doing in terms of the meaningful participation and self-representation agenda.
Sure, thank you, and thank you for the invitation to speak today. I can't really articulate more effectively, what meaningful participation is than Sana, Zakira, and Mohammed have done. I mean, clearly, the discussion about refugee policy and responses to refugees is very much dominated by people who don't have the personal lived experience of ever being forcibly displaced. And of course, I'm in that situation myself, being born and always having lived in Australia. As you mentioned in introduction, I've been with the Refugee Council of Australia since 2006. And when I joined the organisation, I was actually quite surprised by, or shocked really, by how few of the people living in Australia who'd been refugees, how few of those people were actually involved in the discussions about refugee policy, and that all the perceived experts on refugee policy were people such as myself who actually hadn't had direct experience. And yet within Australia at that time and still now, there are hundreds of thousands of people who've been refugees at some stage in their lives. I could also see, that the organisations which were funded to work with refugees were run by people, who also didn't have any personal experience of being refugees. There were certainly people with refugee background, often in quite junior positions as bilingual workers, and some organisations did have some people with refugee background in middle management. But the organisations that were doing voluntary work out of hours, and more often the places that newly arrived refugees went to for help are often voluntary organisations, and their work was largely unrecognised. And so from my point of view, I mean, I could see that in terms of social policy in Australia, that those organisations working on refugee policy were a long way behind many other areas of civil society in Australia in recognising the importance of lived experience in refugee policy. And so, yeah, I thought that as an umbrella body involved in research and advocacy, that we actually had a responsibility, the Refugee Council of Australia, to try to do better ourselves, and to learn and potentially to provide an example of how an NGO could respond more effectively. When I went to a UNHCR meeting for the first time, which was UNHCR's NGO consultations in 2006, I was even more shocked by the fact that there were probably 350 people from around the world, and there was only one person that I could identify as being there representing a refugee voice. And it's actually a woman from Australia who was born in Sierra Leone who paid her own way there. And I thought, this has to change. She had been supported by the University of New South Wales, and so I thought, well, I can actually learn from them as to how they've gone about doing this. And I think collectively we need to be much better at the very least, ensuring that people with direct personal experience of being forcibly displaced are in important international discussions about refugee policy. And so we, each year from 2007, we've been working with refugee communities in Australia to ensure that at least from Australia, there are refugee representatives included. And for years, these two organisations based in Australia were really the only ones that actually even bothered to do that, or even to think it was important. What's been encouraging is that things have changed quite a bit over the last few years. There's, I think, very, very long way to go still. But we and other organisations have been not only challenging ourselves, but also challenging other NGOs, challenging UNHCR to include refugee representatives at the very least in discussions. And we actually had a success in convincing UNHCR and resettlement states to include refugee representatives at the annual Dialogue on Refugee Resettlement from 2012. And now that has actually grown to the point where a refugee steering group is actually co-organising those events along with government, the government host for the year, an NGO and UNHCR. So things have moved along in a significant way. But I mean, for our organisation, we've had to confront the lack of people of refugee background within our own staff team. So we've been looking at for the past several years, we've actually changed our recruitment practices to make sure that and now we have in our management team and in our staff more people of refugee background, and also to ensure that whenever we're involved in significant events in Australia, that we're doing it as much as possible in partnership with refugee-led organisations. And as you mentioned, we've played a small role, but in trying to support opportunities for people with lived experience of forced displacement to come together to look at how they can develop refugee-led advocacy, and that's helped change. I think, in a small way, we've contributed to the development of some of the important national, and regional, and international organisations which have developed in the last few years.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Paul. It's really interesting to hear your reflections on how things have changed over your time in the sector, and also to hear some more about the Refugee Council of Australia's work as one of the organisations that I think is really a strong ally of refugee leadership. So I want to come on to this question. As we've heard now quite clearly from Paul, there has been some change in the right direction in recent years when it comes to the amount of space that is being created within the international refugee response system at global, but also at national levels. But before coming on to kind of what needs to happen now to accelerate that change, I just wanted to briefly ask, and maybe Paul, you could expand on this a little bit, building on what you just said. just for the benefit of those listening who might not be so familiar with these discussions, it would be great just to unpack a little bit what you think are the main factors that affect refugees' meaningful participation. You know, what are the factors that either enable it or constrain it? And what impact do you think the pandemic might have had on this? Paul, would you mind picking up on that again first?
Sure. I think the factors that impact on the meaningful, the opportunity for refugee representatives to be included in important discussions. I mean, a lot of it relates to awareness of the organisers and of the of the organisations which usually get the floor of the fact that things do need to change, and I think people such in positions like mine actually need to, for things to change, actually need to very actively take an attitude of being prepared to step back from the microphone and actively provide opportunities for others. And in fact, challenge people who invite, me and others to speak at events to consider people who can speak, more authoritatively from their own experience. And I think our organisation has tried for some years to, not only to decline opportunities for me and for others to speak, but to actually actively put forward others who are the right people to actually address the issue. And it's interesting that once people who have direct personal experience of the issues are actually talking about the policy issues, actually there's a different response from the audience. I, for instance, I have a number of colleagues who are on the Refugee Council team, including the Deputy CEO, Adama Kamara. And, she's been with us since the beginning of the year and already getting more invitations to speak at key events than I am because, people can see that that not only does she have a knowledge of the issues, but she actually also has a depth of experience and a whole lot of community connections to refugee communities. She's originally from Sierra Leone. But I think, people who commonly hog the key dialogues, hog the microphone at key conferences, have the opportunity to address governments and UNHCR from an NGO perspective, actually need to be prepared to step back, but also to understand that collective advocacy is more effective when people with direct personal experience are actually have the opportunity to engage at high levels in policy discussions.
Great, thanks very much for that, Paul. Maybe Mohammed, can we come to you next? Would you share some of your thoughts on that question of what are the main factors that affect refugees' ability to participate meaningfully?
Yes, to add to what Paul has already mentioned, I think it's the issue between the power havers and the people who have the power to grant the access for refugees and to also understand the importance of the lived experiences being at that room and not just being invited as ticking the box to share their personal experience, but how can we use the lived experience to even reflect and to be the source of originality of bringing in new ideas and new solutions and developing these into an effective policies. And I think that's importance of refugee meaningful participation needs to be realized and needs to be accepted, by the power havers, by the people who have that space. Once that access is granted, then refugees can interact and then share their own lived experience, but also the experience from their own community. And I think that's what needs to be done. The other issue is As we mentioned before, refugees are coming to a predominant narrative about who they are and what they are. So they are already being boxed in a certain narrative. So to break that narrative, so from the policymakers, from the power havers, and then to see refugees as an active agents, as people who can lead policies and can lead solutions, and I think that's shifting the narrative. It is quite challenging for many of the refugee advocates to even have. And it starts from there, but it also goes to, if you look at the refugee-led organizations, to even be able to organize among themselves, they are not being seen as credible enough to even receive funds, and that's another issue. So it's a problem of how a certain narrative is being shaped in the whole society, and then how to break that narrative in a different domain, not just at the policy space, not just at the philanthropy and foundations and funding, but also in the media. You see less. You don't see refugee representatives are talking about the refugee issues. They are not being seen as expert of their own lives, and that is the main issue. We are making their voice not trustworthy, while we are giving the space to other experts, and we are taking their words for as a trustworthy, and that's re-enhancing the certain narrative, refugees as helpless. They don't have agency. They always have to be at the bottom of the ladder of that society, and they always need to be victimized and victims seen, and in order to make sure that that system is still functioning in the same way that it is right now functioning.
Right, thank you, Mohammed. That's really interesting, and I think again lots of common themes coming up here about the need for those who currently have power and resources and control to let go of that and to open up the space to others, but the need for dramatic changes in mindsets and in narratives in order to enable that. Something that you said now, Mohammed, about refugee-led organizations not even being seen as credible enough to receive funding reminded me, son, of something you were saying in your first intervention. Would you like to speak a little bit more about that specific point, and about the exclusion of refugee-led organizations from the system?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Paul and Mohammed brought up multiple factors that are very real, and the bias around refugee-led organizations. If we think of refugee participation and the right for self-representation, it's really not also, we're not here talking about only individuals in their individual capacity. We are talking about individuals who are part of institutions, who create and lead institutions as well, and organizations. And if you want to talk, I just want to say that actually there's always this myth from anyone that from a lot of people, when you ask them or demand from their end representation of refugees, they say they're not, where are the refugees? There are no refugee-led organizations. And I think over the past 2-3 years, the case has been proven. There are so many organizations that are founded and led and run by people who have experienced forced displacement. But where are they? They have been excluded systematically for multiple reasons. We have the barriers that we talk about, bias that Mohammed has been talking about is very real systematically with refugee-led organizations. In the best case scenario, by NGOs and by big institutions, refugee-led organizations seen as implementers in the field implementers, and that's the best case scenario. They are not seen as strategic thinkers, as solution designers and drivers of those solutions or leaders. And so bias is really here and very alive in the system. I would say the other thing would be, besides bias, is institutional barriers. And I hear talk about not about the institutional barriers within refugee-led organizations. I actually talk about institutional barriers in the system itself, in the institutions that give money, in NGOs. They have been designed in a way, and their internal policies that really makes it so difficult to engage with refugee-led organizations. There's always fears around legalities, and also, if you look at all calls for applications for funding, they are by design exclusive with the language with the expectations and by the expectations of capacity of certain organizations to have to apply for this funding in first place. All different applications require certain capacity in organizations that small ones like refugee-led organizations don't have. So the call for application by design is exclusive. And then also, I think we have to also acknowledge the lack of institutional establishment within ILOs, which we come to the issue of catch-22, that ILOs don't receive funding to grow, and they can't grow because they don't receive funding.
Great, thank you, Sana. I think you laid that out very clearly. And as someone who's been working in Turkey for the last 8 years, I've seen up close this exclusion by design that you're referring to. Zakira Hanım, as the leader of a refugee-led organisation yourself, perhaps you could reflect on some of these questions about what it is that excludes or includes refugee leaders and refugee-led organisations.
Sorry, I think there was a problem with the channel. Yes, it is solved now. Yeah, like that is experienced in many societies. The refugees, like well, there are prejudices and as an organization, we wanted to fight against these prejudices. So we started starting with a home in order to see the change. Look at the neighbors, the street, the NGOs and local administrations, and then it has to have a national and international dimension to hear the voice of the refugees and to hear about their problems. Now, when there is a problem concerning the migration. Migration is seen and shown as a negative factor. Of course, these also can depend on policies, on perceptions. This is how we can say that with the migration, it has an impact. Like if somebody as a profession in his own country, he can be jobless, but if he is a doctor, he comes as a doctor. Yes, yes, it has been expressed very clearly, like if a doctor comes as a refugee, like he says, that is a good brain migration, intellectual migration. Now, we think that this is how we have to assess the refugees. All the refugees are not ignorant. All the refugees are not helpless. What we want to do, if we have to change that perception, of course, the refugees can be useful. Like Paul gave examples about Australia. That is, it can see that in Germany as well. In Germany, there was a Turkish population which did not have people who could represent them. But recently, we see that the Turkish refugees and their children in Germany are entering into politics, and they are able to represent themselves. Of course, so why you can be a refugee, but they are people. They are still human beings and people, even if if they give them opportunities and they can occupy good positions, and of course it could also contribute to the country. So we should look at not only at the negative dimension, but we try to create a network the refugees, I think a network for refugees is important so that they can be represented. 4 or 5 people cannot make their voice heard. But if one person is elected for the local NGOs, local organizations, national organizations, so there could be like one voluntary representative among the groups coming from different nationalities. If education is very important for each person, for that is very important, so that they know their rights, that they know their responsibilities. If you live in a country, what are the rights? What is the legislation? They have to know that, and then they also have to what are their responsibilities in the country they are living. Now, of course, what would be the decision makers do, like the Mukhtar, that said that refugees are negative and they are a burden. This is no, they could contribute, they could also be helpful, and we do try to provide the communication of the in Kayseri. We talked with school teachers and school directors, and so when you have that is, you know, the preconceived idea against the refugees, even in schools, against their children. So we have to correct all the wrong information. We organized information meetings, and we talked with the community leaders for Syrians, another one for Iranians, and another for Afghan refugees. Of course, the refugee leaders should be able to represent their community. That would be a contribution to the policy making and implementation. And if they can express their ideas, I think that would be an enabling policy.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, I think that adds a really interesting perspective, and particularly you underlined the importance of refugee-led organizations and networks in addressing some of these constraints and creating space for refugee participation. We've been receiving a number of questions, and I'm conscious that we've only got 40 minutes left to go. We've got about 20 minutes until I want to open up to questions. So to move on to the next question, I wanted to ask, so we've heard quite clearly that there's been some progress, but there are still a lot of constraints, particularly around kind of the mindsets and the prevailing narratives that limit the ability or the space given, not the ability, the space given to refugee leaders and refugee-led organizations. So what I wanted to ask now is, what do you think needs to change to achieve this kind of systemic transformation in the system to create that space for refugee participation and leadership, and to reorient the system to support that? And in particular, what do different types of actors need to change in their actions to make this possible? Thinking about cities, municipalities, but also civil society, central governments, donors, etc. And maybe, Mohammed, if I could turn to you, it would be really interesting to hear your thoughts on this question, particularly from the perspective of your work with cities and municipalities in the past.
Josephine, just if you can repeat the question.
Sure, sorry, it was a long one. What do you think needs to change to achieve systemic transformation in the global refugee response system? And what do different actors need to do to make that change happen?
Yes, I mean, definitely. So it depends on what level are we talking about. So whether we are talking about the cities, or are we talking about international NGOs, or are we talking about the international system and the policymakers? And so it is. I think there's a different approach to how that systematic change could be achieved on the different levels. But I think one that goes for every actor in the sector, and that is basically accepting and believing in the importance of refugee meaningful participation, and making the space, making the access for refugees and refugee leaders to be included in the design process of any policies in the discussion, and not just in a consultation way, how it has been in best cases, but really having them creating a structural place for meaningful refugee participation at every level. You mentioned the cities, and I see the cities actually very interesting actors in all of these discussions, because even if we look at the international level and international spaces, cities also have been excluded from these spaces. So at the local level, I think, and the cities has been at the front of responding to refugees, and including refugees at the local level. It shows, I mean, we have seen it here in many cases in municipalities in the Netherlands, when they included refugees and they opened the space for meaningful refugee participation. You see directly the impact of such a change. We have seen it here in, we organize something that we call expert pool, where we bring refugees together in discussion with the cities, and then we evaluate and redesign the processes and the instruments of each policies, and then and it's a very concrete discussion and concrete actions that comes out of such discussions. And right now we see it, for example, in the municipality of Rotterdam, that after we organize such an expert pool for them, so a pool that have expert refugees with lived experiences, Rotterdam right now took that over, and then they made it a sustainable space for refugees to be included in policy discussions. So you see a direct exchange and a direct impact on the lives of refugees at the communities. And I think when we go to the international spaces, cities and refugee advocates, refugee-led organizations are the right cooperators on how to making sure that they are able to access the space at the international level, the system and the funding, and all these obstacles and in the system that they are being faced with.
Great, thank you, Mohammed. And actually, we're getting a few questions through about specifically the role of cities in creating space and solutions for refugees and other types of migrants. So maybe if we turn now to Sana, would you like to reflect some more? It could be on cities, or could be on the action that's needed from different actors within the system to try and accelerate progress towards meaningful participation.
Yeah, I think when we think of actors in the system, I think it's good to not think, similarly as we always say refugees, it's good to think about the people we work with, not only as institutions, as individuals. And when I think of what needs to be done, it really comes to the personal first, the organization, and then the systematic level. There needs to be changes and reflections on the personal level to change the mindset of people who are part of this system on a true allyship. And that requires really humility and a lot of acknowledgement of how someone has been contributing into exclusion in the system, even with the best intentions. And then how do you actually bring these conversations to your teams and into your organization? And for organizations or institutions, that really means, as I said, big internal changes in the who and in representation and in ways of working. And that requires dedicating human and financial resources for organizations to go on journeys of diversity, equity, and inclusion, to go on journeys of decolonizing the way they work and on those institutions, which eventually, as you do that and as you again like work on the representation on your team and create environments where teams could actually thrive, and people of forced displacement have the safe environment in your organization to come and actually influence your strategy, influence the design of your programs and of your policies. Eventually, it reflects immediately on your projects and the outcomes of your work. And then it doesn't need to be a box checking consultation. You know, it doesn't need to be the last step after you design a program or a project, is that yes, you go and consult refugees and be like, yes, actually we worked with refugees on this, and yet your whole institution, the whole design process, it was exclusive by design. And then I think that leads to the third level, which is on a systematic level, how you bring those internal changes you've done and your journey as an organization and as an individual into also the systems you're operating in. And I think we don't do enough of that. And we tend to, it's really not a rocket science, honestly, Josephine. There are so many movements currently and in the past that we could learn from. So many movements about people who are marginalized and have been demanding their rights, and talk about what can we learn from that, and also what a true allyship means and the different levels that a true allyship has to manifest in. And somehow in the forced displacement sector, in the humanitarian and development aid sector, we still tend and lean towards separating those conversations and pretending we're talking about something completely mysterious and we don't know how it's going to happen. And it's really not that, but it's about the acknowledgement. Inclusion is expensive. Inclusion takes time and takes effort, and it challenges this urgency culture that has been created and our ways of working. So unless you really want to enable meaningful inclusion in a systematic, deep way, then any other efforts is going to be tokenistic.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sana. And thank you for bringing in this kind of three-layered way of thinking about inclusion and the work that's needed to actually make it happen within individuals, within institutions, and at the systematic level. I think that's a really helpful way of thinking about the multiple layers of changes that are needed, and forcing us all to take the responsibility as individuals, but also to push for change within our institutions. And I think the point that you made just now about the fact that, you know, inclusion, it doesn't just happen by itself and it doesn't happen for free. Making change happen costs money, it takes time, and it forces us to question many of our assumptions about the ways that we've been working and the things that we've found to be important until now. So thank you for that. And thank you also for opening up the discussion to this question of kind of what is good allyship? What does that look like when we talk about this issue of participation and self-representation? Zavgir Hanım, would you like to share your reflections? We've had quite a lot of questions about, you know, what is the role of cities? What can be done to make sure that refugees are able to participate, specifically within city-level decision-making processes? From your work in Turkey, maybe you could share some reflections on that.
Teşekkürler. Şimdi
Thank you very much indeed. Actually, first of all, the policy needs to be changed, and because the policies, especially for we need to start with the NGOs, and there are some NGOs actually there are some NGOs actually where they do not know, especially some NGOs do not know about the refugee law. Actually, they need to learn about. And actually, so if we are an NGO working for the refugees, and it needs to be the same for the governmental bodies and the local governments as well, and they need to involve actually the refugees and the migrants in their own staff members, and actually then actually so there should not be no prejudice for the, and there should be some information dissemination and awareness raising campaigns both on the local level and also on the national and the international level, and it should be done the same. And therefore, and this awareness raising should be, and in order for prevention of the prejudice and the bias actually on this area, and the policies needs to be changed. And when taking a decision, and of course you know that the actually the opinion of the refugees are not asked actually, and of course I don't see that in practice they are not much involved in the decision making procedures. And actually as we need to first think from the first hand that the refugee or a migrant is a part of the society, and therefore no exclusion should be injected or implemented against them. Therefore, while developing and compiling a policy or strategy or a plan or program for the refugees, and the refugees themselves needs to be included actually, and therefore of course they will feel excluded actually if they see that a project or program pops up actually without their involvement, and therefore they may be also have prejudice, and also they may have their own concerns about design of the design of the project or the plan. Even though they like the idea, maybe they will not be participating to those projects just because that they are not taken into consideration. There may be different incidents or different occasions where that their voice needs to be voiced, and therefore the refugees themselves needs to be heard, and they need to, and these ideas needs to flying on the air or over the cloud, and they need to be actually heard therefore in practice. And so it is only possible through their active involvement in the decision making that their existence and their involvement meaningful involvement could be assured. And therefore and if they can share the same table together with the decision makers, then they may have an opportunity to have a voice on their fate and on their existence in the host country. And that is only a way that they can feel the host country that they are contributing instead of being a burden. And so that actually we try to do the same with the municipalities and also with the non-governmental organizations as well, because our objective was a capacity building activity to actually strengthen at the first place the migrants themselves, to create the leaders, the community leaders among themselves. And because as actually if they can speak together and in a company of a coffee or the tea, we see that many change can be produced. And of course still there is a stigmata, as you know, that on the refugee side and on the population side, but it should be this vicious cycle can be broken only with we started to inject and implement these awareness raising campaigns and also information dissemination activities. And actually and if there is a congress, or if there is this if there's a congress, for example, it should be the refugees that needs to be speaking at the first place, and they needs to be financed actually. And without money and without the budgeting or the funding, of course no refugee initiative can be long lasting or permanent. And therefore this tiny civil society organizations or the tiny initiatives needs to be supported on a very local level, starting from the very bottom on the field. And actually, as you know, that even though actually some of the NGOs organize voluntarily on voluntary basis on these activities for getting utmost benefit from these initiatives. Of course, a support mechanism and a funding mechanism needs to be established, even though they are tiny in their neighborhood or in their district, and the overall impact may be really so huge when it comes to national level.
Thank you so much, Sakira. Thank you. I think you really laid out very clearly the importance of municipalities and cities working together with the refugee-led organizations to change policies and to understand really what it is that refugee communities need. Now, we've only got 23 minutes until we're going to get cut off at the end of this panel. So, Paul, could I ask you to reflect just quickly on these questions? One of kind of what do you think needs to change to achieve this systemic transformation in the global refugee response system? And two, from your perspective as the Refugee Council of Australia, how, if you could share some of your experiences in trying to be a good ally to the movement, that would be really helpful. Thank you. Okay,
well, just thinking about an NGO or a city or a government or any decision maker, there's looking at how to be a more effective ally, more effectively include people who are refugees in decision-making processes. There's probably several steps, and if I just reflect on our own experience, or say, for instance, if a city really doesn't have much of a connection with the refugees living within its community, the steps would be similar. The first is to begin with consultation, to actually engage refugees, in your community or in the particular sphere of influence in which a government authority or NGO operates. So, and to learn, to understand what are the perspectives of the refugees that you are seeking to work with and alongside, and also to understand what currently exists within refugee communities. Because I think, as we've discussed before, people who are outside of communities of refugees greatly underestimate the level of organisation that exists, because many of the organisations are informal or voluntary, poorly resourced, but they're still strong and fundamentally important to supporting refugee communities. So begin with consultation and research. The second, is to examine how it's possible to create more opportunities for people who've been refugees, for representatives of organisations that exist, to share platforms on discussing policy and directions. So look at how the platform can be shared. The third, and of course also as displacement occurs, communities of refugees form. So, in any particular location, you could either have, well-established refugee community organisations, or you could have newly displaced people, who have yet to make connections with others who've also been displaced. So, depending on what the situation is, locally, cities, NGOs, government authorities can also play an important role in providing a platform for refugees to come together and to actually, effectively to organise, to share ideas about the issues that affect them, but also to provide a platform to develop stronger refugee-led organisations, and that's something which our organisation has attempted to do, over recent years in different ways at local, national, and also at international levels. And then, as those fourth point is, as those organisations formed, or you identify strong organisations that already exist, look at how to develop partnerships with those organisations, and how you can actually share power, share authority with strong and effective refugee-led organisations. And the final, also look at your own organisation too, and your own recruitment practices. Because particularly for policymakers or for government organisations that are attempting to engage with communities of refugees. The most effective way of being better at doing that is to actually include people who both have the expertise but actually also have direct experience and direct connections with the people for whom the strategy is being designed. So look also at your own internal practices and recruitment. And the final step, which is the step which Sana has particularly been speaking about, is sharing resources, and to look at, and I mean, ultimately it does come down to money as organisations develop, and I think this is a situation which we're trying to confront in Australia, where we and others have been involved in supporting the development of national refugee-led organisations. We're actually now at the point where we realise that those national organisations need funds if we're able to work in partnership with us in the way that we would actually prefer. While Sana spoke about an international effort to get finances for refugee-led organisations, is actually also a similar initiative happening in Australia, in fact, inspired by the connections that Sana has been involved in to try to also advance, from an Australian perspective, the further resourcing of refugee-led organisations, so that they can actually they've got the resources and greater capacity to be the sorts of partners that NGOs, governments, and refugee-led organisations would actually want them to be.
Brilliant, thank you, Paul. And I think that really lays out a very clear step-by-step checklist for those in our audience who've been asking questions about what is it that cities and municipalities can do to better engage refugees, and how can cities and municipalities be spaces to further refugee leadership and meaningful participation. So I think that's a really helpful, clear checklist. So we've got 16 minutes until the end of our panel, and we've actually, I think, answered several of the questions that have come through from the people handling the questions so far. But there's a couple more questions that I want us to turn to now. There's a specific question about Afghan refugees in Turkey. And the questioner asks that there are a lot of unregistered Afghans in Turkey. And the questioner wants to know, is it possible for civil society organizations to fully represent Afghan refugees in such a situation? So I think this can be a more general question, which several of you can share your reflections on, this question of the representativeness of refugee-led organisations. But maybe Zakira, if you'd like to go first in answering that, as it's specifically about Afghan refugees in Turkey. Thank you.
Aslında şimdi mesela
And actually in Turkey and in many other countries, as you know, that due to the internal clash in Afghanistan, and actually it is on the hot topic of the countries, as you know, that there are people living in Pakistan, Iran, Turkey, and other parts of the world. And UNHCR actually creates a report on annual level, as you know that. And according to 2020, and actually after the Syrians, it is the Afghanistan people with the third level with the 2.6 million of registered refugees, and 1.4 million lives in Pakistan, and 900,000 in Iran, and in Turkey we have 180,000 Afghans who have international protection under the refugees status, and actually in Pakistan there are irregular migrants in Pakistan, Turkey, and Iran, and actually there are 130,000 in approximately the irregular, unregistered, registered Afghan migrants. And actually, as an NGO, and of course, we unfortunately we will not be having any any service for unregistered Afghan refugees, and unfortunately still, of course, and there are people coming from Afghanistan illegally, and actually especially in 2020, and they couldn't get HES code, and you cannot go even to a restaurant, and within the health safety code was not provided to the illegal people, and we tried to raise their voice actually, because this especially, as they are irregular migrants, as they do not have any identity, and as they have to maintain their life, actually they are very scared if they are sick, because and actually they will not be access to the healthcare services without any registration, as they do not have any identity document that they may, and actually they are afraid that they will be sent back to the deportation centers if they are found out actually in a healthcare center. And actually most disadvantaged group is the migrants, and of course the most disadvantaged group is the irregular migrants who are unregistered, and actually they cannot be even vaccinated today. And it is the same actually, I don't know, and I can assume that it is the same story for other countries as well, because they are not even vaccinated, for example, and as they are unregistered, there is no NGO, or there are no organization that represents these irregular migrants. And however, of course, we would like to register, and of course the sheltering is a fundamental human right, and therefore, and actually they can deport us, and of course, and we try to fight against these issues because of these problems.
Thank you for answering that. Çok teşekkür. Sana or Mohammed, would either of you like to add any reflections just on this general question of the representativeness of refugee-led organizations, not specifically about Afghans? If not, we can move on to another question, but if you would like to come in, please go ahead. Okay. I think I'll move on then. All right, so we had another question, and this one was specifically directed to you, Paul, although I'm sure others will have opinions too. But one of our listeners was wondering about how the participation of refugees in decision-making processes at the national level is perceived by wider society in Australia. Do you want to share some thoughts on that?
Well, I suppose it would be a mixed picture, as always. But I think, there are changes taking place. I mean, Australia, of course, unfortunately, has a very very divisive policy in relation to the seeking of asylum in Australia. I mean, I think traditionally governments in Australia have not liked people actually seeking refuge, within our shores, but have much preferred refugees to be resettled, under government-controlled programs from other countries. So there's quite a lot of controversy associated with refugee policy in Australia, and yet also, on the other hand, Australia's refugee resettlement program is actually quite positive and constructive by global terms. So we see some of the best and certainly some of the worst refugee policy in the world in one country. So it's always a confused picture. But I think, there has been a change within governments in its thinking about the inclusion of refugee representatives in key discussions. And something which is actually quite significant to me anyway, that happened just in late August, was that the Minister for Immigration formed an advisory panel on the Australia's resettlement of Afghan nationals. And I was one of 12 people appointed to it. And, in the past, our organisation has been appointed to panels of this sort. But the senior Department of Home Affairs official who was pulling it together when she discussed the fact that this panel was being formed, she was saying, well, we're actually recruiting and we want to have at least an equal number of Afghan-born people of refugee background on this panel. And, you know, because of the importance of lived experience in developing, you know, advising the government on policy. That was the first time that I actually heard an official at such a high level within the Australian government actually believe that, or express a view that it was not only important to include people of refugee background in a panel such as this, but that it was important that they should make up at least half, you know, of the panel. So I think, you know, things are shifting, but of course there's a long way to go. You know, this question of representation was mentioned before. I mean, one of the things which I find is really insidious as soon as there is any refugee representation, often one of the first questions that is asked is how representative is this group? You know, and I think whereas when other groups, you know, of NGOs or government officials or whatever get together, no one asks, you know, how representative is this group? You know, who isn't here? Whose voices needs to be included? But as soon as we see refugee representation, this question is asked fairly quickly, and I think you know, that can be both a tactic to undermine refugee representation, but it can also be you know, people who are or basically I mean, it's a question that needs to be confronted. That of course, in politics or in any field of endeavour, it's impossible to be fully representative. But you know, unless you actually have voices of people with lived experience at the table, directly inputting to policy, you're actually going to be producing bad policy, and you know, undermining that by questioning the representative nature of those that have come forward or have been chosen or whatever, you know, it certainly undermines undermines the forums which actually really need direct input from people who can speak from their own and from their communities' collective experiences.
Wonderful. Thank you, Paul. Thanks. I think that's a really comprehensive answer to that question. So we've got just over 5 minutes now until the end. So I just wanted to, Sana and Mohammed, there haven't been any specific questions directed at either of you, but I just wanted to give you both a chance just to say a few final remarks before I wrap up. Mohammed, would you like to go first?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, when it comes to you know, how to ensure refugee meaningful participation, I think one of the first steps that you need to do is to creating this allyship that we have been talking about, and I think that means that you need to start reflecting on your own position in the system, what position you have, what power you have, in order to make sure that to make a strategy to include refugee-led organizations or refugee communities or refugee with lived experiences into that certain space or landscape or organization. Whether this at the city, then city needs to start building sustainable partnership and cooperation with the refugee communities, with the migrant communities in their own city. I mean, we had the question before about undocumented Afghan refugees, but I mean, how it is, I mean, being undocumented means that you are not being seen by the system. So, and to what extent would the city take the initiative and making sure that to include them, despite having the status or not, making a safe space for them, you know, to be included. Another things that is, I mean, very interesting that when you look at the cities is that every city has its own vision into like 3-5 years. And every time when you read a vision about a city, then you read that they want to become an inclusive city. Yet migrants and refugees are not being invited into that vision. They are not envisioned into a city how they are going to have their own designing and space within that design, within that vision. So I mean, this is something maybe to all the local actors that have been with us today, is to reflect into this question: to what extent would migrants or refugees would have a space into co-designing that vision itself and be included in that vision. And I'll stop here and thank you everyone, and give it to Sana.
Thanks, Mohammed. Sana, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you, Mohammed. Yeah, I mean, I think I will go back to like what we should leave with is that every person, as an individual, as an institution, any entity can do something about it, must do something about it. And I walk into this journey. I think it's important for all of us to think of it as a journey and walk into this journey with the expectation that it is time consuming, it is expensive, change is difficult, but it's about time. It's about time not only because it's the right thing to do, but also because it's impactful actually. When you include the people who have the proximity, your solutions are just way more informed and way more successful and impactful. So it's like really not only because it's the right thing to do. And I really, what it comes to right now, it's about sharing resources. Power comes from money in our system, and as long as refugee-led organizations are under-resourced, that means their participation is under-resourced. The impact of their work is under-resourced. The evidence about their impact is under-resourced, and then we can't fundraise for it because there is no evidence of impact. So I think re-questioning of what we're doing, as especially NGOs and INGOs and big institutions that control the pots of money, it's about time to think about really sharing the pot a bit.
Great stuff. Well, thank you so much, Sana. I think that's a really strong note on which to conclude things. So, I think today we've heard from all of our panelists a very strong and compelling case about why self-representation and meaningful participation for refugees and other people who've experienced forced displacement is so critical and needs to be put at the centre of all policymaking relating to refugees and forced displacement. I mean, Sana just made the case extremely well then. It not only leads to better and more effective policies and practices and programmes, it's also an ethical and a moral issue. Refugees and people who have experienced forced displacement have a right to a say in the decisions about their lives. And it's for these two reasons that this issue needs to be put at the centre. We've heard clearly that there has been progress in recent years. Refugees are more included in decision-making processes now at multiple levels than perhaps they were 10 years ago, but there's still a lot of barriers. And we heard, lots of testimony about the problems of bias, the prevailing narratives that perceive refugees as helpless